People ask me what it felt like when we decloaked. They expect something dramatic. They want me to say my hands were shaking, or that the bridge erupted, or that the captain made some speech I'll carry to my grave. None of that happened. What happened was quieter and, I think, more final. I was chief sensor officer aboard the ISV Arendelle. I had held that post for 11 years by the time we drew the Vethani corridor assignment. The Arendelle was a stealth cruiser, not the kind of ship that shows up in recruitment posters. No cathedral silhouette, no visible gun batteries running the length of the hull. From the outside, in the rare moments anyone saw her, she looked almost plain. A long, dark shape that ate light and gave nothing back. That was the point. We did not exist until we chose to. The Vethani corridor was a recognized transit lane at the far edge of what the charts called disputed space. For 3 years before we arrived, the Varath consensus had been using it. The consensus was not a government in any sense humans would recognize. It was a synthetic mind, distributed across several thousand processing nodes spread through that region of space, that had concluded, at some point in its history, that the most efficient expression of intelligence was to model everything and predict all of it. They were not aggressive. Aggression implies uncertainty about outcomes. The consensus was certain about everything. That was the thing about them that our briefers kept underlining and that I kept thinking about in the dark hours of our transit. They had a model for every known spacefaring species. They had modeled us. They had files. They had probabilities. We ran silent for 9 days inside the corridor before the contact protocol was authorized. The protocol was not an accident of diplomacy. It had been negotiated at considerable length by people far above my pay grade. The structure was this. The Arendelle would hold position inside the corridor, within range of the consensus's passive sensor arrays, and at a specified time she would transmit a standard identification pulse and decloak. The consensus would receive the identification. The decloak was to be simultaneous with the pulse. They were to see us at the same moment they heard us. That had been important to the negotiators. I did not know why at the time. I understand it now. The Varath had been tracking us for at least 6 days before the protocol window opened. We knew this because their passive array returns showed attentive repositioning, subtle, the way a very still person shifts weight without moving their feet. They were not trying to hide their attention. They were watching, and they wanted us to know they were watching, which is its own kind of statement. They had tagged us. They had filed us. In their model, they already knew what we were. I spent those last 9 days watching my own instruments and trying not to think too hard about what the consensus had in that file. Our profile under stealth was smaller than the Arendelle's true hull. That was the nature of the drive. The cloaking system compressed our sensor signature down to something the size of a Scout-class courier. Courier mass, courier drive emissions, courier thermal. That was all they had. That was what their model was built on. The decloak order came at 3:40 ship time. Captain Yevna Rail read it aloud to the bridge once and then set it down. "Sensor, you have the mark." I did have the mark. I had been watching the countdown for 40 minutes. I initialized the identification pulse and dropped the cloak in the same keystroke. The way you'd flip 2 switches you've practiced flipping so many times they've become a single motion. What happened on my screens in the next 8 seconds I have tried to describe many times, and I am not sure I've ever gotten it right. My own instruments were the first to show it, the Arendelle's full hull signature resolving as the cloak released. We knew our own ship, of course. I had seen those numbers 1,000 times, but there is something different about seeing them appear on a screen that a moment ago showed nothing. The mass index jumped. The weapons array thermal bloom spread across 6 frequency bands. The drive field harmonics opened up like a fist unclenching. We were a long ship. We were a heavy ship. The consensus had been watching what they thought was a small courier, and the thing that was actually there was 3 times larger than anything their files said humanity flew in this configuration, carrying weapons, loadouts their taxonomy had no clean category for. I watched their broadcast channel. For 8 seconds it said nothing. The Varath consensus had been transmitting continuously on that channel for the entire time we had been in the corridor. Routine packets, atmospheric data relays, internal traffic that spilled into ranges we could intercept. It was like sitting near a river. And then the river stopped. 8 seconds of silence from a distributed machine intelligence that had never, in any recorded interaction, gone silent. I did not say anything on the bridge. Nobody did. We all understood what we were watching. It was not fear exactly what the consensus was doing in those 8 seconds. Fear implies a threat being processed. What the consensus was doing was something colder. It was discovering that its model was wrong. Not wrong at the edges, wrong at the foundations. The thing they had categorized, measured, and assigned a probability distribution was not the thing that was actually there. Everything downstream of that file, every prediction, every protocol, every contingency they had run, was built on a number that was off by a factor of 3. They had been certain, and certainty, when it breaks, does not break quietly on the inside. On the 8th second, the channel reopened. What came across was not a threat. It was a request for data confirmation. They transmitted the sensor returns they had been holding on us before the decloak, the courier-class profile, and appended a single query flag that our translation layer rendered as reconcile. Captain Rail looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "Send them our registry." I sent them our registry, full hull specifications, mass, drive class, weapons manifest, crew complement, everything. Standard disclosure under contact protocol. I watched the data leave my console and cross the gap. The consensus took 4 minutes to respond. 4 minutes, from a mind that processed at speeds we could not meaningfully compare to biological thought. I have since read analyses suggesting that what was happening in those 4 minutes was not processing delay, but something closer to the synthetic equivalent of sitting very still in a quiet room until you are ready to speak again. I find that credible. When they responded, it was the opening of what became 3 days of careful, formal negotiation. No ultimatums. No maneuvering. The Varath consensus was not built for maneuvering. It was built for accuracy, and for the first time in its operational history, it had encountered a gap between its model and the world that it could not close by adjusting coefficients. It had to rebuild, and rebuilding required information, and information required talking to us. The cold peace we walked out of that corridor with was not a triumph in any conventional sense. No terms of surrender, no concessions extracted. The consensus did not retreat. They don't have the concept. What they did was recalibrate. They updated their files. They assigned us a new category, one for which they had no prior template. In their own internal taxonomy, which we have only partial translations of, the label they ultimately used for humanity has been rendered various ways by various linguists. The version I prefer is simply unresolved. Not a threat, not an ally, not a known quantity, something that did not fit the existing filing system and therefore required a new drawer. I retired from active service 14 months after the Vethani corridor mission. I have been asked, at events and in interviews and by people who knew someone who served aboard the Arendelle, whether I think we won something that day. I always think about the question longer than the asker expects. I think what we did was be seen, correctly for the first time, not as what their instruments had decided we were, not as a small and manageable data point in a model built on incomplete information, but as what we actually were. The ship that was actually there, the mass that was actually there, the capability that had been present the entire time, running silent, waiting. There is a particular feeling to being seen clearly by something that was absolutely certain it already knew you. I watched it happen in 8 seconds of silence on a frequency channel, and I have carried those 8 seconds with me since. The Varath consensus still uses the Vethani corridor. So do we. We pass each other at the established intervals, transmit the agreed identification sequences, and do not pretend the other party is something smaller than it is. It turns out that is enough.